population that will agree that central planning at the national level has been proven a failure multiple times over. Why is it that every company works off of a central planning model, if that is the case?
I'm Tim Bickett, a grain and cattle risk management advisor from Worthington, Minnesota, and you are listening to the Vance Crowe podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today we do an interview with my friend Eric Ward, who is one of the founders of a very unique company called AgBiome. I'll let Eric describe what he does, but this entire conversation unfolds in some really unusual ways because Eric and I end up talking about how their company is structured in order to avoid the bureaucratic hell that comes with most corporations that grow to a large size. They have a really interesting way of managing employees, of encouraging employees to think about their development, and even the way that an employee has to go and ask for a raise by getting feedback from their fellow employees. This is a really interesting conversation. And then we also get into some conversations about science and vaccines and the purple tomato, which was just written about in the New York Times. And Eric was on the board of directors for this small little company that figured out how to create a GMO that what they think many consumers will want, and why it's an important addition to the new crop sphere in the United States. So I hope you enjoy this interview. I'm quite excited about it. During the conversation, Eric and I talk about legacy interviews. This is where some of the listeners have hired me to interview their loved ones. It could be a small child, it could be a spouse, it could be one of your parents. I sit down and have a deep conversation about the values that are important to them, stories of their childhood, and why they made the decisions that they did. And I package this up and send it to you in a video so that you can hold on to these memories of your loved ones in their own words on video. I do them both over Zoom, or if you're in the St. Louis area, we can always set up an in-person interview. And if you're interested to learn more, you can go to store.articulate.ventures, and you can there purchase it and learn a lot more about it. The other thing is, if you listen to last week's podcast, I published a talk I gave at the Arkansas Farm Bureau. I was really surprised by the number of people that reached out to me saying not only did they really enjoy that conversation, but they were asking me about doing talks at their organization. If you are interested in having me visit your organization, my late fall, early winter is starting to book up. So if you're interested, act now by going to vancecrowe.com. There you can find out a little bit about some of the talks that I'm giving. Not all of my talks are listed there, but it'll give you a general idea. And then also a way to contact me, telling me about your organization when your event is. This is a fun and exciting time. I'm really glad that you're around here for it. And I really hope you buckle in and enjoy this interview with my good friend, Eric Ward. Eric Ward, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm as you know, longtime fan, and we've known each other since, at least since before I was aware that this thing existed, but I've listened to several of them since, and I know several of the folks that you've had on, so I'm highly flattered to be in their company.
Well, it's always fun to interview your friends, although it's a little bit difficult because there's all the standard questions that I would ask somebody we already know about. But I think it's a good frame to start off with. You work at the head of a company called AgBiome. What is that company? What do you guys do? And what is your actual role there?
Wow. Yeah, the last one's probably the hardest to answer. So AgBiome started about 8 years ago, and we discover microbes from the microbial communities on our planet that have useful properties. And our core business is identifying bacteria that can protect crops from diseases, insects, nematodes, and the like. So, simply put, what we do is go out into the world. We collect samples of all different kinds, soil, plants, animals, you name it, take them back to the lab, reduce them to just the microbial matter that's within them. So that's basically a couple of filtration steps. We archive those things in ultra cold freezers. So now we have these like undifferentiated pools of all the microbes that were in that sample. And then we can go back to those and identify individual strains of bacteria by, pretty traditional microbiological techniques. And then I think the thing that we started doing early on that was maybe ahead of the curve compared to other people was we sequenced the genomes of every one of those strains that we isolated. So we're now bumping up toward about 100,000 of those, where we have a complete genome sequence, which means we know effectively the entire genetic composition of every one of those strains. And then we can use that as a basis for picking strains that we want to test for useful properties, like can they kill an insect, can they control a plant disease, can they kill a nematode, et cetera. So that's sort of the discovery end of the business where we got going. We now have developed our first product, which is a biological fungicide called Howler. That's been on the market for about 1.5 years. Getting good uptake from growers. It has really good properties. It performs as well as synthetic chemicals do against some critical crop disease combinations. And so we built up a commercial team around that to produce, sell, market that product. And then we have a pretty deep pipeline of additional products coming too. So we're, if I want to steal a term from the IT world, we're a full stack company because we go all the way from a discovered product to actually producing and commercializing it, which is relatively rare in our space in ag biotech. A lot of companies historically have got acquired by somebody when they had a technology somebody wanted, and we made the determination pretty early on we wanted to create a real sustainable presence in the crop protection space that was going to make a big impact on growers' lives and ultimately on consumers' lives as well.
I remember I visited your lab like 3 or 4 years ago, and I was struck by the idea that you guys were doing all this work. You had laboratories, you had offices, you had lots of people working. They were very busy, and yet you had nothing to sell yet. And I remember thinking like how nerve-wracking that must be to be running a business, to be, I don't know if you're racking up debt or you're doing something. Someone is spending money that has not yet been accumulated. What was the experience like of running a startup where you're spending all this money and building all these things before you even have something to sell?
Yeah, that's, I think, a pretty standard phenomenon for people that work in a company that's backed by equity capital. So we have some, very generous and supportive investors that go back to the start of the company. And the assumption is that you're going to spend a significant amount of that equity capital to build value, and eventually the business will be worth enough that they get, a good return on their investment. That's sort of the fundamental idea. We had a big advantage, which was we were able to do some partnerships with major companies relatively early in the trajectory of AgBiome that actually offset most of our negative cash flow. So we were actually cash positive, I think, in year 3 or 4. And those were, our basically R&D partnerships where we perform specific R&D tasks in collaboration with the big partner, who then gets some limited commercial rights in a specific field around that R&D. And that brings money in the door to help build the research platform that we built. It also gives us what's usually referred to as external validation, which means that people that are non-experts can say, hey, well, big company X wanted to work with these guys, so therefore they must have something going on. And it puts the onus on us to keep our technology and our science at the cutting edge so that people do want to work with us. Otherwise, we don't really have very much to offer. So that's been a significant part of our revenue stream, certainly all of it before we launched Howler. And it'll continue to be a significant part of it for the foreseeable future, because we like doing these partnerships for all the reasons that I said. We've also been able to use that model to get value from our discovery platform outside of our core business. So a good example of this is we created a little entity that worked specifically on discovering novel genome editing tools. Generally speaking, of the CRISPR related stuff that I'm sure you heard a lot about, because we had like thousands of these things in our microbial collection. So that team worked hard on identifying those, pulling them out, showing that they worked. And then we did a really great deal with a company called Elevate Bio up in Cambridge back at the end of last year, where they got exclusive rights to all that technology for human therapeutics, which is that's not our background at all, right? We basically have nobody who knows anything about that in the company, but we're now able to capture value in that partnership with Elevate for whatever they do with that genome editing technology for cell therapy, for gene therapy, you name it. So that, that's one of the ways that we've been able to capitalize on the broad scope of the work that we've done without losing focus on, we're going to stick to our knitting and our core business in crop protection.
So when you're doing crop protection, you've gone out, you've isolated one of these microbes in the soil. You don't actually know which ones do nothing at all, which ones do things that are positive, which ones that do things that are negative. So how does this work when you're trying to figure out which ones are you doing? Like, all right, let's just go ahead and test sample 1 through 100,000 to figure out which one kills the bugs?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of that does go on. That's, what's typically called random screening. You just pick stuff out and test it and see what works. So there's always a measure of that goes on. You can try to bias that in various ways to improve your odds. So one way to bias it is maximize the diversity of the stuff that's going into that random screen. So this is really taking a page out of the book of the way chemicals are screened, the way, traditional crop protection chemicals are discovered, the way a lot of synthetic molecules like in pharmaceuticals are discovered. You try to cover as much like space as you can when you're looking for activity. So that's one way you can bias it. Another is you can look at strains that have activity already, whether they came out of your own activities, your own screening, or whether they're maybe products that are on the market or something in a patent. And we can, in a really super quick way, go across our whole genome collection. So let's say we get an initial hit. It looks like it has decent activity on insect X. We can now take that genome and compare it to all the other ones in our database and all the public ones and say, okay, what else is out there that looks like it? And get to a subset that are relatively closely related, and then screen all those guys in the next wave. And that allows you to drive really quickly to like a optimum of a local activity peak, you would call it. So rather than saying, okay, the first found guy is our best one, if you know that there's a whole bunch of other strains related to that first found one, why wouldn't you just test those too? And because the odds are, pretty clearly, 1 over n, whatever n the number you screen are, that first one had the highest activity. So we do a lot of that stuff. And that increases in power as you get more positive data, right? As you get more hits in your screens, and as you increase the size of the genome database that you're working off of. So we're of course getting more positive data on hits all the time, and we have a pretty big campaign underway to kind of massively increase the number of microbial genomes in our collection as well.
So, from an outsider perspective, if you don't know anything at all about crops or about trying to get rid of insects or fungus, you might think like, hey, there must be hundreds of thousands of chemicals. Why aren't we just going and pulling things off the shelf and spraying insects with them and moving on? Like, why are we doing this? What seems like it's not even a needle in a haystack. The needle in the haystack actually literally doesn't capture how small of a thing you're going after. So why do this as opposed to just grabbing things off the shelf?
Yeah, it's, the motivation to do it has gone up over the last couple of decades. If you look at the history of crop protection chemistry, which goes back, roughly speaking, in the modern era is around the end of World War II, through about the year 2000, the incumbents in that industry, which include, my former employer, which used to be called Ciba-Geigy, and a couple mergers later, now it's Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, Corteva, which is the old Dow and DuPont. All those companies did a really good job of identifying new, what we call mode of action chemicals at regular intervals. So those are new ways of killing the thing that you're trying to kill. And the reason you have to do that is because guess what? Evolution says that anything you put out there, you're going to select for resistance to eventually, right? This is just like human pathogens becoming resistant to antibiotics, which is a widespread problem that people talk about. So we've kind of hit the end of the line on traditional crop protection chemical discovery. It doesn't mean there aren't more out there to find. And of course, those companies are still working hard on that. But for a whole bunch of reasons, the discovery rate has fallen off rather dramatically. So in a world where you need to keep coming up with new modes of action all the time, where else can you turn? And a natural place to turn is to the microbial world, which is sort of unfathomably vast. The best estimate is there's probably something like 1 trillion individual species of bacteria on Earth. And those things are swapping DNA all the time at a community level. So they're probably evolving faster than you could even collect them. So it's probably literally true that that's an infinite resource of potential activity. And the other thing we know is both from the pharmaceutical industry and to some extent from the crop protection industry, those microbes make a ton of biologically active molecules. And they've been at it going back to, the start of life on Earth, a few billion years plus. So there's been this giant selection experiment that's been going on for stuff that can kill other things for a long time in all the environments where microbes hang out. So why not try to tap that as a source of activity to solve this problem? So that was sort of the two-headed premise behind founding the company. And I'll give primary credit to my best friend and close colleague, Scott Eucnus, who's also at AgBiome. He was really the one that promulgated the start of to start a company around this idea back in the summer of 2012.
It sounds like you're doing something absurdly complex on the science side, but then also to start a company, get out there and get financing, figure out what all the regulations are. How do you even bring together a group of people that are capable of doing, this level of complexity that all comes together in one single company?
Well, it's, Dan Thompson, who runs our business development, always calls it building the plane while you're flying it, right? There's a fair amount of that goes on. So we're, not everything just comes together. Okay, boom, there it is. It's more like you identify what the rate limiting steps are at each stage, prioritize those and work on those. So, step one was, can we identify a sort of core group of people that are going to want to help get this thing going once we launch it? And one of the benefits of having worked in this industry for a while and having been in this geographical area, so I'm in the Research Triangle Park vicinity in North Carolina, as you know, where there's a ton of talent, a lot of connections going way back. Pretty straightforward to identify people that maybe want to work with you again. And then Scott had terrific connections in the venture capital and public markets world as well. From his previous experience, he had helped start a company called Paradigm Genetics back in 1997 that went public. And he was able to make some phone calls to specific investors early on that got us somebody to lead an initial investment round very quickly. That's probably not the typical experience. But I think increasingly venture investors are interested in putting money into teams that have had some kind of success previously, right? They see people that want to do it over again, and they understand that plan A typically doesn't work. So whatever the initial, here's what we're going to do business plan is that you can invest in that looks perfect, will at some point get altered, if not go completely off the rails. So what you really want to invest in is resilience and grit and the ability to pivot and make good decisions on the fly and adjust as necessary and. So, big news flash, it all comes down to the people, right? That's how it always is. So I think that the thing that gave me the most confidence at the start was we attracted a few people that we knew pretty well that wanted to help start this thing with us. And were willing to pour their heart and soul into it right out of the gate, realizing it was an unproven premise. But, you get there if it's a fundamentally good idea, if you got the right people, you believe in it, you're going to get there. It's nonlinear and painful sometimes, but it does happen. So.
It seems like with what you're describing about things failing, or at least like your plan having to get thrown out, you'd have to be incredibly conscientious, because a lot of people, when the thing doesn't manifest the way that they had imagined it, the ability to just keep waking up and trying new things is overwhelming. It's something that's draining. Are you naturally a highly conscientious person, industrious, that wants to get things done?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I gave you the health warning before we started. I hate talking about myself in public fora where I would be considered to be opining about my own goodness. I think it's really important to be surrounded by a team where that goes on, because there's no one person that's going to carry that ball continuously. Yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this in teamwork before too. You're having the absolute shit day, but the other guy's like, come on, man, we're going to do this. Even if it's not an overt statement like that, but just by the way they're carrying themselves, the way that they show up, you get that feeling off of them. So it's important to be surrounded by a group of people that you can derive energy from when you need to, but are also, if you're in a leadership role, you're well aware of your obligation to bring energy to them too. You can't just be the guy that always needs to get propped up, right? The energy sink is tough for anybody to deal with at any stage in their life, no matter what they're doing. And it's probably lethal to a startup environment if it's there on any kind of consistent basis. You're living on belief in the early days, and you just have to stick with it. And then, you start to rack successes up, of course, right? It's the old plan small wins thing, right? You're going to, every little thing that goes well, you celebrate the living shit out of. So
I never imagined before I had a child, like, anytime I was ever working on something, if you get down or something doesn't work, like, you can always just hit the reset button and then you're back again the next day, or you can hit things going again. But when all of a sudden you have a child with pressure that's never going away, you don't get to be like, all right, I'm done with that habit, or I'm not doing that thing, I'm just leaving it behind. Now you've got a thing where that is going to be, pressure for all the right reasons. I never imagined how much harder it would be to continually go back to that well and generate energy. And I think it's hard to describe to somebody that's not had that, but it really is extremely taxing.
Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of people have drawn parallels between parenting and leading people in an organizational context. And in the worst case, that can get construed as some sort of paternalism and, infantilizing the people you work with. I don't think of it that way at all. It's more like, it's exactly what you're saying. Consistency of behavior is at a huge premium. And, that's something we aspire to as a parent. And it's definitely something you aspire to as a leader as well. You don't want to be the, let me rephrase that. I don't want to be the mercurial guy. I'd rather be, somewhat positive all the time, rather than be like going nuts, awesome once in a while, and then a complete asshole, if some or all of the time other than that. It's something you work on, right? I can't claim I'm anything close to the aspirational state for that, but that really helps. And it gets exactly at what you're talking about. Every day there's more stuff you got to do. There's a guy here, Jerry Bell, that runs Bell Leadership Institute, and he says something to the effect of, you don't have to solve all your problems today because they'll still be there tomorrow, right? So it's like, you can't let it overwhelm you.
AgBiome has a very interesting way that you're set up, and it's really important to me to think and learn about how you guys have set up your corporate culture, because I talk all the time about bullshit jobs and about how much of the human energy and innovation is just dissipated as heat. So this concept by David Graeber, bullshit jobs, I'm sure you and I have actually talked about this, but for anybody that doesn't know, he basically says automation has actually already overtaken much of modern American working life. It just has come in the form of emails and telephones, and your ability to get so much work done so much faster than you ever could before. Your Excel document now can tabulate things that used to take you days or weeks or even months to put together. And so, but the normal corporation has not realized this, because the way that you get power in a large corporation is that you have a larger and larger budget. Your budget signifies your status, it signifies a lot of things. So a manager gets into a relationship with the people that they're managing where they're saying, look, I know you don't really have 40 hours a week of work, but I need you to keep coming in because I need that budget line. And as long as you keep pretending to do work, I'll keep pretending like I'm managing you and giving you good feedback. And, you can just fill up your time with going to endless meetings, and you can fill it with, wasting time on your computer. And this leads people to a sense of meaninglessness in their work. And I definitely saw this in corporate America. I've seen it in several different, whether it was international organizations all the way to corporations. And I actually began to believe that this was an inevitability. I thought, like, this is just the way corporations are because you have to have the hierarchical structure. But you have talked to me a lot about how you and your partners and really your employees have come together to collaborate and figure out another way to structure the employee-employer bureaucracy to still be able to manage people and get things done, and yet not have so much work and energy and human meaning dissipated in the heat of a traditional hierarchical bureaucracy. So as I lay that out, how do you explain to people how your organization is set up?
Very carefully. I'm partly joking. I think one of the dangers of what we've done is people define it in the negative. You don't have bosses. You don't have a traditional hierarchical org chart. And it's actually a live discussion in the company now. What are the core elements of what we do that are kind of inviolable and we must preserve and steward and nurture as the company grows, because we have aspirations for the company to grow very significantly. I think the one way to think about what we do is, from a high level, we're trying to capture the power of self-organization in a positive sense. So I think it's a fair statement that probably everybody that listens to this podcast, and probably even a much larger population, that will agree that central planning at the national level has been proven a failure multiple times over. Why is it that every company works off of a central planning model? If that is the case, makes zero sense. And there's a very dramatic demonstration of this. There's a book called Brave New Work by a guy named Aaron Dignan, who kindly visited our place about a year and a half ago. And he has a picture of an organizational chart in there. And the question is, from what year did this organizational chart derive? And so if you think about everything over the last century in a company, exactly the stuff you're pointing out, the IT piece is probably the most obvious, but so many things have changed about the way people work and the way companies function in the last 100 years, but organizational charts look identical. And I think the one he has is from like National Cash Register in 1909 or something, but it could be, you pick your company X today, it's the same thing. There's a box at the top, there's about 12 boxes under it, and there's a whole bunch of boxes under that. So what we're trying to do is capture the maximum engagement of everybody in the company. That's really the end goal. How you get there, it almost doesn't matter. But our belief was that avoiding some of the same things you just talked about with the bullshit jobs is a requirement for that to happen. It doesn't ensure that it will happen, but it's a boundary condition to prevent it from happening. So if you set up that kind of a structure where people are incentivized to complexify their jobs in order to create bigger budget centers, in order to have more people working for them, you're going to end up with all that bureaucratic bloat that seems to end up everywhere, seemingly inexorably. I think there's significant exceptions to that rule, Vance, but they all, they're exceptions, right? It's not the way most people think about it. So sort of organizationally, what we've tried to do is create a structure that's pretty rigid for a short period with respect to achieving goals within projects. So we have a so-called accountability chart, which means that if you're working with me on this project and this other person is responsible for the goals of those projects, we're accountable to that person to get our pieces done within that project. That person is not, however, our line manager who has kind of sole control over our destiny within the company, which is often what happens in bigger companies where they basically set your salary. They have some significant input on hiring and firing authority. They're going to be your primary mentor for your career development, you name it. And we've tried to task those functions out more in a distributed way across the organization. And the goal of that is that everybody has a really good boss. Because I know you saw this in your corporate setting previously. If you work for a quote unquote good boss, life is great. Right? I mean, it's like you're working for a different company than if you're working for a not so good boss, or even worse, a really bad boss. So rather than saying there are bad bosses in the world, therefore we're not going to have any bosses, which makes like zero sense. But I think a lot of people think that's how we got to where we're at. Instead, we've said, let's try to outsource or distribute the functions of a really good boss so that everybody has a similarly positive experience. And implicit in that is we don't fix that. The thing is not locked down. It can and should be able to change relatively quickly when it needs to, right? Like the best case would be we have a shift in what the company needs to get done. For whatever reason, a crisis arises, a new opportunity presents itself, and very quickly we can redeploy resources to address that. And that's very hard to do in a fixed structure. People naturally gravitate toward constancy, and I'm not like damning specific people, or there's these dumb people out there. It's like human nature. When stuff's good, don't mess with it, right? It's like, I think there's a pretty powerful evolutionary basis in that. So getting people comfortable with change is not really ever going to happen. All you can do is sort of mitigate the pain around change. And if you get people used to doing it and understanding that it's not going to affect their personal stake in their own welfare when that happens, it makes it a lot easier to do. And so
what does that look like in practice when you're talking about people don't have one solid, standard boss? Instead, we've kind of, disaggregated it or put it out into the wider company. What does that look like in practice?
Well, so there's this, basically accountability lead for whatever your primary activity is or activities that you're involved in. So that's one person or a couple people you're involved with. We have a role that we call an agent, which is really you can think of it as kind of an ombudsperson between you and the company. And their role is to deeply understand and steward our core beliefs and help promulgate those, help people that are newer to the company navigate what to do and where to go and how to find things out, and basically be the network of knowledge within the company. And critically, they can help when you're in a conflict with another employee, because those arise frequently, as they should if you're in any sort of an innovative environment. And a lot of times people aren't comfortable resolving those themselves. We try to select for people that have the ability to do that, if not the desire to do it. But the fact is, a lot of people are pretty uncomfortable having a face-to-face conversation where they're going to, disagree really strongly about something and then try to come together and make amends afterward. So the agent, in the best case, can help, lubricate that process by whatever way, coaching somebody before that conversation, listening to their concerns, maybe giving them some suggestions about how to move forward, that kind of thing. And then they also play a role if the person's in the worst case, in a situation where they're under some sort of disciplinary action or performance review. The agent it serves as, if you will, an advocate for that person. It doesn't mean that they're going to disagree with the company's stance about that person's performance, but rather they're going to help the person process the information that's coming at them and act on it constructively, because that can be a pretty overwhelming experience if you get put in a situation like that. So and those are all things that like a line manager would do normally, right? Like you and I are fighting. We can't stand each other, even though we work in the two offices next to each other. We would both go complain to our bosses and say, Vance is a jerk, Eric is an idiot, he never listens. And then the two grown-ups solve the problem while we get to behave like children and not solve it. So what we try to do instead is get people to, be the adults that they are in every other aspect of their life, and work on that stuff and resolve it. So that's a chunk of what the agent does. And then this is long. All these are long-winded answers.
No, this is awesome, man. I'm loving this. I have no problem letting you go long.
Good.
This is great.
And then another role we have is what we call a development partner. So that the development partner, rather than the here and now stuff, which is what the agent does, is what do you want to do with the rest of your life? And that's a big deal for people that are in their early part of their career, in particular, but it should be a big deal for everybody. What do you want to do? What do you want to get better at, and why? And think really deeply about it. And the development partner helps the people put together, first formulate a goal, whatever that is. And that goal, of course, can change. It can be daunting to set a goal because it means you're fixed.
Yeah.
You may not get it. You're eliminating all these other possibilities from your life. You name it. There's a million reasons people don't like to do it, but then put together an actual plan to get there. And that's over and above just, well, I'm going to go to some random conference and hang out. It's more like, well, I'm going to go to this conference because I want to learn about these specific things. I want to meet these people. I want to get practice in this sort of interaction, whatever it is. And that's true across the company, that everybody has a development partner. I have a development partner. It's our board chair. So just because I'm in a later career stage doesn't mean there aren't all kinds of things I want to work on, behavioral changes that I want to make in myself that will make me more effective in the job that I need to do, that kind of stuff. And so we expect everybody to have a plan like that. And a strong incentive to have such a plan is it's pretty damn hard to get advancement in the company if you don't have a plan like that, right? So it's pretty, that's a way to get people tapped into it. So we don't have any formal titles in the company at all. People pick a descriptive title in most cases, and they're free to do that. Scott has joked since the beginning that his is Lord Humongous from the first Road Warrior movie. So, and if you want to get ahead in the company, we call it a career milestone, the career development milestone. You need to have a plan for what you're implementing in order to do that.
So I don't want to give away your like. I think the way you're structured reminds me that this is probably a comparative advantage. So I don't want you to have to give away everything. But I remember the day that we talked about, if you don't have titles and if you don't have this like linear progression to make people feel like, I'm moving forward, there is one way that people feel like they're moving forward, and that is that their salaries increase. And you guys have come up with a very interesting way, although it would take a certain type of person to be able to do it. How does one get a raise inside of AgBiome?
Yeah, so that's this career development milestone thing. And what we do is the first step is you self-nominate for it. And we went to that several years ago to try to correct an issue we were seeing, which is that we used to say anyone can nominate anyone else, which sounds great. The issue is if you're sitting there laboring away at what you do, improving how you do it, perfecting it, becoming an expert every day, and you've been sitting there for 3 years doing that and no one's nominated you, you can pretty quickly be thinking, hey, what the hell, am I chopped liver? What's going on here, right? Versus if you have to self-nominate, it puts you in the driver's seat of developing your own career. And that's deeply uncomfortable for some people. Highly acknowledge that fact. It doesn't mean that you're best friend, colleague, coach can't say, hey, why don't you nominate for a career development milestone? You've been doing all this great stuff. So after they nominate themselves, then they have to go through a round of feedback, which they, by the way, they should be doing anyway. That's kind of part and parcel of what we do is everyone needs to be continuously seeking feedback about their performance from the people that they work with. And, it doesn't happen universally. It's aspirational. It's another one of those things. It's uncomfortable to do. So people need constant motivation to do it. But at least when they want to get an advancement in the company, they have to do that. So they go around with a targeted set of questions that they put together, typically with their agent, and harvest feedback about their performance. If they read things about themselves that seem complimentary and like they maybe have hit sort of a step change in what they're doing, then they take that to a committee that's called the Advancement and Performance Committee. And those folks take an initial look and say, well, yeah, this looks pretty good. Do you want to go ahead? And if the person says, yeah, I want to go ahead, the next round is the entire company is informed that that person has self-nominated. So anybody now can weigh in with feedback so that they can't cherry pick the feedback that they got for themselves. Assuming that goes well, then the committee decides whether or not to go ahead with a career development milestone. And then that a condensed package of information is passed to a compensation committee, which then determines an appropriate salary raise for them. And in a final step, the person reports out to the company the feedback that they got. And that can be done in an oral presentation at one of our all hands meetings. It can be done in an email summary. Everybody hears really good things about themselves. They also hear things about themselves that they want to continue to work on, and they share that with the company so that everybody sees the importance of embedding feedback into that process.
This is extremely holistic, right? And to me, I think, wow, what an amazing thing. But I have to imagine that it creates a selection pressure that is also negative in some way. There's probably certain types of people that you would love to have in the company, but that style of management doesn't work. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's it's sort of a, I don't know how to phrase it exactly. It's like a lost opportunity cost for us. And we discussed this a fair amount. There's a fine edge between ambition that is sort of raw ego drive for self-betterment at the expense of others, and ambition that's, I just want to kick ass and do great, and I want to do it with a whole bunch of other people. And the people in that latter group, I know you've talked to Jim Rudd a couple times, and his whole Game B thing is predicated on a hypothesis that there's enough people in the world of the type that he wants to work with in this Game B setting. And I believe there are enough people. They're really hard to find, like really hard to find, right? And that's just the reality. And so what we're giving up is people that are more on that continuum, the ones that are a little more edgy. In the worst case, they might have a somewhat of a tendency to self-aggrandize or climb over you to better themselves. We lop that curve off maybe a little bit earlier than would be optimal. But the net result is we just basically don't have hardly any of that behavior, or relatively little of it. I mean, I'm sure people in the company are going to listen to this and go, God damn, this guy's full of shit. He doesn't know what's going on. But I mean, realistically, it's a relatively apolitical environment. And now it requires continuous effort to maintain that. I do believe that there's a almost like entropic property of, maybe it's a tribal behavior ultimately that will cause people to look for separateness, that'll cause people to seek hierarchy. There's been a lot of philosophical and political writing about this over the years. Jim Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner from University of Virginia, basically was the kind of founder of public choice theory. In one of the last speeches he gave, talked about this concept of parentalism. And so rather than like a big organization being paternalistic and imposing its will on people, and big organization in this case would be like at the national level, his thesis was that there's an increasing number of people that want to be treated that way. They're looking for a parent to basically tell them what to do, right? So one of the sort of corollaries of our management system is people have to be willing to take on responsibility where appropriate. And it can be hard to get people to do that consistently. They're going to ask for permission almost by default. You have to force them to not ask for permission. You have to force yourself not to solve their problems for them. And it's challenging.
Yeah, I think this is a problem that is transcended time. Like, I don't think there's anything new about this. I think
totally
if you go back and read in the Bible, you know, the Israelites were wandering around in the desert. They were free people, and they went and they said, "We want a king." And the prophets were like, "No, bad idea. You do not want this. They're going to enslave you. They're going to make you do all kinds of things you don't want to do." And they're like, "Yeah, but we would feel a lot safer and a lot more comfortable if you gave us a king." So they got it, and sure enough, that king instantly turned into a tyrannical power. And I don't think that's a mistake that that's in the Bible. I'm sure there's other old writings that are like this, and it's just something about human nature that makes people like that, which reminds me of what we're going through right now, right? Where there is so much of a drumbeat for people to trust the science, right? And it's this concept of there is this truth that's out there. There's a group of people that know what that truth is, and if we would all just listen to them, then we'll be okay. Where do you think this goes? Is this different than? I mean, it seems to me like this is obviously
it's a really
drumbeat. Yeah.
No, I think it's a super good observation. I think that's a subset of what I was just talking about. You know, people want to. They want to have a higher authority that they can devolve any responsibility to in a lot of cases. And you can see the personification of that can be, you name it, you know, whoever, Biden, Trump, Fauci, you know, pick your camp, right? People want to pin their hopes on this person as having all the answers. And this trust the science mantra is, it kind of gets under my skin. You know, I see all the yard signs, you know, we believe in, and the science is dynamic and it's changing all the time. And if there's one thing we've learned over the last 18 months is that epidemiology probably is second in line behind economics and its ability to have any predictive power. And number two, we didn't know shit about how respiratory viruses are transmitted. You know, the sad state of affairs is we had tens of thousands of people dying of flu every winter, and nobody really knew what the population dynamics of that transmission was, right? Which is kind of bizarre when you think about it. It was just like, yeah, whatever, 50,000 people die every year. It's like car accidents. It's just built into the thinking. So you don't really worry about it. So then this thing comes along, which is, you know, admittedly way worse. And we're not really in a situation to deal with it. And I think the biggest fallout is going to be historically, the U.S. population had pretty good trust in entities like the FDA or the Centers for Disease Control. And, you know, that served the country well when those organizations are behaving in a high functioning way. They completely abrogated their responsibility in any sort of visible way to the non-expert like me. Like I just read last night, newsflash, you know, I get the New York Times news alert on my email. The FDA is going to accelerate the timeline for giving full approval to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. It's going to be now Labor Day instead of later in the fall, and this is like an internally leaked thing. Pardon my French, I know that this is going to have an E next to it. Now, what the fuck are they waiting for? Something on the order of, you know, if you assume about a third of the people vaccinated in the country got the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, that's more than 50 million people now have been vaccinated. What data set do they need that allows them to say it's no longer being used under an experimental use exemption? It just doesn't make any sense. And if that's, you know, now it's like, oh, well, if we give it official approval, now everybody will want to take the vaccine. People had no idea what analysis goes into that decision. even relatively well-educated people, I'll put myself in that population, unless you want to do a real deep dive, it's pretty hard to figure out what they're doing. And that goes back to the initial approval of those vaccines, right? The decision was taken, the non-decision was taken. They weren't going to do human challenge trials. There were people lining up that said, I'm willing to get infected with the virus so that from a small data set, you can figure out if this vaccine works. No, we can't ethically do that. God forbid if we infect a few hundred volunteers and one of them gets sick. That's horrible. Meanwhile, there's 3,000 people a day dying while they're sitting around twiddling their thumbs saying, for all these ethical reasons, we can't do a human challenge trial. So that kind of stuff just drives me nuts, because that, if you want to trust science, then do science.
Yeah, this is very interesting and a novel take. I was talking with somebody over the weekend, and they made a really interesting point to me, which was, you go to get the vaccine, you sign a whole bunch of things that say that the Merck and Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, none of them are responsible for this. You are responsible for this. And yet, if you are sitting there saying, like, wait a second, if I can't go back, if something goes wrong on this and it's all on me, then I choose, no, I'm not going to do this. And yet then they're being told, like, you're a part of a death cult. You are. I heard Stephen Colbert last night comparing it to, I don't even remember but basically saying you're a part of a death cult and you are embracing death to die for your savior. And it's like, you can't have both of these things happening. You can't say the individual is 100% responsible for whatever happens here and simultaneously say you have no authority and autonomy or decision to make here. And if you make the one that's different than the one that we want, we're going to berate you. These two ends will never be squared, and it's only going to cause more conflict.
Yeah, I totally agreed. I'll bring it back around to organizational behavior. I think one of the things that we try to do at our company is to avoid setting up contradictory incentives. That's what happens so often, in the same, going back to the sort of corporate hell paradigm. We all want you to work. You work together as a team. You guys are a team. And then December 12th rolls around and it's performance review time, and the manager has to stack rank his team of 18 from highest to lowest. And the top 3 are going to get a 7% raise, and the bottom 3 are on a list that somebody puts in a file for the next time they restructure, and they're going to get fired. And it's just this, like, how can you say those two things with a straight face? So I think that you pointed out a really potent example of that, right? It's like, you must take this, it's your social responsibility, sign here 20 pages later that if it's your social responsibility, it's your ass if anything bad happens to you. It's weird, right? And it's all about incentives. There have already been studies showing that people's resistance breaks down when they can just walk in the door to do it. Like, they literally get flagged down off the sidewalk. They don't have to plan to go do it. They'll do it if they get paid $100 to do it. There's all kinds of ways to motivate people to do this stuff, but putting long fine print forms about all the various ways they could die in front of them isn't probably the best way to motivate people. And by the way, a lot of those forms are going to be there after it's approved. You won't have to sign it, but you get the flu vaccine every year. You get did you get the thing about Guillain-Barré syndrome? It's like, great, thanks a lot.
So what do you think about the way that information is being handled, right? So inevitably, if we post this interview and we say anything about the vaccine, there's going to be a CDC warning on there. There's certainly modulation of information. And you have the challenge of, you want people to not be able to hijack the system and use fear and disgust and political rage to cycle out bad information. But at the same time, we don't really always know what is good information and what is bad information. So, what's your take on how to handle this kind of seesaw here?
I don't know. I'm probably not a great person to ask about this. I'm a passive participant in social media largely. pretty avid Strava user. I like to just put my workouts up there, which somebody pointed out to me is the most intrusive social media because it puts an exact map of where you were every time. But I don't really pay attention to a lot of the stuff that's on, YouTube that's getting flagged or Twitter or whatever. I think those are a net positive still because it's just more stuff out there. There's more platforms. I was born in 1960, so I grew up in the era of, there were 3 networks and PBS, and you had the local newspaper, and maybe if your parents were better educated and had extra money, you got a Sunday New York Times or something, and that was it, right? And so I think it's fantastic. We live in this wonderland of information. Now but I am sympathetic to the fact that you have to be like really discerning, and you encounter the boundaries of your own ignorance on a daily basis if you're really going deep on stuff. Like I'll get interested in something and realize after reading for 10 minutes, it's like, well, okay, if I want to devote the next 4 months of my life to this subject full time, I could maybe become minimally conversant in it. And so at that point, I'm just like, okay, I'm out. I drew my conclusion. So I like to kind of have the, firm conclusion weekly held way of approaching stuff, because there's always new information that can come at you that'll change your mind pretty dramatically, potentially.
Yeah, the Dunning Kruger effect is like wild when you start to realize it's not just everybody else that overestimates what they think they know, it's me.
Yeah.
Because when you start to really internalize that, and you had mentioned before about your employees, you really want them to have development plans. You want them to make a choice. They could be anything. Their optionality is wide, but if you don't choose something, you won't move towards it. And that's the same way with information. I was at an Airbnb this weekend, and they had about 20 DVDs that you could watch. I almost never watch movies anymore. My wife and I sit down and we're on like Apple TV or, Amazon Prime, and we flip through so many choices that I can't decide on any one, so we give up. Yeah. But I noticed that we watched like 3 movies at our Airbnb because there were 20 selections. And out of those 20, I would be like, oh, I'll watch that one. It's the best out of these options. And so this massive amount of information, I think in many ways makes me look at far less than what I used to, as opposed to more. It's the paradox of the human mind.
And there's this paralyzing effect, right? Did you read the book? I don't remember the title. Aziz Ansari, semi-canceled comedian. I think he's been rehabilitated after that. Wrote a book about dating, and he talked very specifically about this: how romance in the modern world, in a Tinder world, you have such a plethora of possibilities at your fingertips. There's always something better. Like, why would you stop and choose this one person? Because, there's like thousands more out there. And he cites data from, like the 1930s that some vast percentage of people that got married, like grew up and lived within like 5 blocks of each other in New York City, right? Because those are the only people you met. Most people are perfectly happy. They went on to get married and have kids who now are, their kids are using Tinder, right? So I think it's the same effect where you can get paralyzed with this barrage of choices coming at you. And this has been, well studied, of course.
It's funny you say that. So I do all these legacy interviews with older people, and there's been a trend within these legacy interviews where people want to do it with their spouse, or they do one and then their spouse does one and they do one together. And it's really endearing. But because these people are all, 60, 70, 80, you find a lot where they grew up together, or they met in middle school, and it's exactly what you're saying. They believe with 100% certainty that they found their soulmate. This was the one person on earth that they could have lived with, and but it really comes down to the fact that, well, that's because you had limited options, and when you made that choice, you fully committed to that choice, and so you manifested the thing that you were looking for. You could have chosen not to. Certainly, I'm not doing interviews with people that didn't do that. But there's something really powerful about way slimming down your options, not actually making you feel like you didn't get what you wanted, but actually making you far, far more content with what you have.
Yeah, totally agreed. And, taking it back to just intake of information, I think that's a I don't know whether this is true, but I think having bridged the world, the pre-internet world and the internet world, which my generation was lucky to do, I had to, for my PhD thesis, I had to go to the library and get like microfiche cards out of biological abstracts and put them in the reader. It'd take you hours to find something. It gave you the ability to intensely focus and go deep on something. Like I literally don't know if I could complete the work that I did in today's world. I give my kids so much credit for being as focused as they are, because there's all this stuff coming at you. But if you develop that ability to focus early in whatever way, then having all these inputs that you can integrate and turn into your own sort of narrow casted channel of shit that you care about, that's a fantastic thing to have. So I see nothing but positives coming from even the big tech companies. At some level, I could give a flying fuck what Google knows that I searched for. Like they send me ads that are more relevant to what I want to look at. Or I've got an Instagram feed. I follow a bunch of espresso machine shops and bicycle riders and stuff like that. And so I get all these cool ads. And I didn't know that existed. Doesn't mean I'm going to buy it every time, but I'm fine with that, right? I don't see it as some sort of dark conspiracy to own all my information. I do think it's important that people understand that the business model of those companies is not to serve the customer, it's to serve the advertiser, right? And I think that's lost on a lot of people. So, but beyond that, it's all good.
So recently, you were interviewed for a New York Times article about something I knew nothing at all about, which was the purple tomato. So what in the world is a purple tomato, and why would anybody want one? And how did that all come about?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So Kathy Martin is this really terrific scientist at the John Innes Center in Norwich, England, where I had the privilege to work for a while. I had known her previous to that. And she came up through the ranks of developmental biology and understanding the biochemical pathways that lead to the synthesis of pigments in flowers, actually in snapdragons was the model organism. And what she hit on as a fantastic idea was to take two regulatory genes out of snapdragon and put them into tomato, which those two regulatory genes, you can think of them as like switches that flip something on. They turn on this pathway for what's called anthocyanin biosynthesis. And she did it in a way that it specifically turned on in the fruit. And anthocyanins are the chemical compounds that give the purple color, for instance, to blueberry skins or eggplant skins. They have a variety of health benefits attributed to them. You probably know a lot of people like to eat these dark purple fruits, blackberries and the like. People trivialize it as antioxidant. It goes way deeper than that. They have various effects on human metabolism that appear to be positive, ingested in higher quantities than most people's diets have them. So Kathy's idea was, look, people eat a hell of a lot more tomatoes than they do blueberries. Why don't we make a tomato that makes blueberry levels of anthocyanins? And that's what she did. So there's purple tomatoes out there. People are going to say, well, that already exists. Well, actually, if you cut any of those open, they're sort of greenish red in the middle. It's just the skin, the pericarp, that's purple. And you have to do this genetic engineering trick to turn that pathway on across the flesh of the fruits of things purple all the way through. And Kathy, along with a close colleague of hers going back to grad school days, Jonathan Jones, another scientist there at the Sainsbury lab in Norwich, he's also a friend of mine, decided they were going to start a small company that would own this technology and try to commercialize it as a GM crop that had actual consumer benefit, as opposed to the GM crops, most of which out there now confer like insect tolerance or herbicide resistance to corn or soybean, which consumers don't care about unless they absolutely hate it for reasons that they don't maybe completely understand, but they hate it anyway. So that was the idea. It's sort of a Sisyphean challenge to try to put a crop on the market that's genetically modified that people actually like. And so I got asked to be on the board of that company something like 14 years ago now. It's an overnight success story, obviously. And we now, what's changed over the last few months is the USDA altered their rule structure so that they more stringently adhere to their mission, which is determine whether genetically modified crop is a plant pest. And they eliminated a couple of the things that had been done as a matter of course by the big companies who could afford to do it, like doing a field trial. So for instance, tomato, it's not weedy. It has no wild relatives in North America. And presumably there's nothing about turning the fruit purple that's going to turn it into this pestilent weed species that's going to take over the planet. And I think that's a reasonable presumption to make. So now the USDA only says, we just want to review whether the thing is a plant pest risk, which is all they ever had been doing anyway. But the standard had been you do multi-year field trials and all this other stuff, which we basically didn't have the institutional will to do at any reasonable rate, obviously 14 years later. So we submitted what's called a request for a regulatory status review. That's ongoing now. We expect like early next year, the USDA will say, hey, this thing is now considered no longer a regulated article. It's passed through our scrutiny and anybody can grow it without notifying USDA, which would be required now if you were to grow it. So we have a plan in place to put together a limited release of seed for 2022 growing season. There's a website. Here's the paid promotional. It's bigpurpletomato.com. You can go on there and register your interest. And we're going to try to get seed into the hands of avid home gardeners who would like to grow this thing and do kind of a bake off among probably different varieties. So the purple trait's been put into different varieties of tomato that have different agronomic properties, different taste properties, get people to say, hey, we like this one the best, or this one didn't work very well. And then the following year, do something more like a real, commercial launch. So that's kind of the genesis of it and where we're going with it. And, we may attract some corporate interest at some point. The companies typically will say, we can't possibly do that because consumers don't want GM crops. Well, I can tell you right now, from a very difficult to find website, there's a couple hundred people that sure as hell do want it. And we're operating off the Y Combinator theory of it's way better to have a tiny, passionate customer base than it is a big, inchoate, lukewarm customer base. That's how we're starting out.
To me, the GM battle is largely over. I mean, certainly you have the Chuck Benbrooks and the Megan Westgates that were listed in that New York Times article. Those
Sure.
are the people that either run the non-GMO verified project or the one that's kind of, scary doomsayer about GMOs. But it truly will take something like passionate tomato growers that want to put something out there and then have their friends over and they're excited and they show it to them and they cut it and they open it up and they eat it. And I think this is a really fascinating way to do this. And I also think that this applies pressure to the government to get rid of what I consider to be like a complete invention by the large corporations to create these giant moats of regulation. If you're Monsanto, which no longer exists anymore, you think, like from the outside world, they think, oh man, look at all these activists. Look at how much pain those activists caused Monsanto. And they did in terms of lawsuits over chemistry, but not over the regulation. Because what ended up happening is that you have all these activists that say, oh, they're unsafe. You've got to test these more. This is, they're just so dangerous to humans. So then Monsanto will come along and be like, all right, well, why don't we just add, 2 or 3 more years of testing on there, knowing that each year of testing might be anywhere like all the way up to $10 million a year. So now you've just added $20-30 million into the regulatory process. And if you're a little tiny company that's trying to do it, then you don't have the option to get your product all the way to market. You must sell to the large companies. And so they created this moat where they said the only way over this is if you use our drawbridge. And I think it made it like you said in the article, exactly. Like the activists made the companies into exactly what they feared, which were just large, dominant, giant organizations.
Yeah, I have no quibble with that at all. I just loop it back to the organizational bureaucratic structure discussion from earlier. There's zero incentive in most companies for the regulatory groups to make themselves leaner and more effective. So you've also got an incentive of, well, I'm going to have a bigger budget center if I can complexify this thing, right? So that's where having kind of real singular commitment to the larger corporate goal. The larger corporate goal should be, we want to get out a really high quality product as fast as we can because that's good for everybody. But, that's what you run the danger of losing as the organization gets bigger and more complicated. I'd rather optimize my silo instead, right?
I remember vividly when the announcement came out that Bayer was buying Monsanto, the regulatory people going around saying, you know what they really wanted? They really wanted our regulatory team because, we're so good at putting things through. And it was like, it's just that you guys built a system and knew exactly how to navigate it and could just keep brute forcing the problem. So anyway, man, I'm really excited that you guys have done this. I think it's a net positive for the world. And I, for one, I grew Harry Clee tomatoes. So I would be very interested in growing purple tomatoes.
So we're actually working with some of the same parental lines that Harry uses and introgressing the purple trait into those. So, we should be able to produce something that's very similar to some of those varieties, but has this purple phenotype. And it just shows up when they ripen. It's just like instead of turning red, they turn purple. It's pretty cool.
Well, Eric, we're going to round out here, but before we go, you're just wrapping up summer. You've got, all sorts of wonderful weather in North Carolina. How are you going to spend these next few weeks of summer?
My big excitement is over, I've got to tell you. So one of my sons got married last Saturday out in Marin County. So Gertie and I were out there for about 9 days leading up to that, which was just fantastic. And the wedding couldn't have been better, more heartwarming on all kinds of levels. So that was great. And then I've got the next milestone events on my calendar are you may be familiar with the band Dead and Company, which is 3 of the surviving members of the Grateful Dead, plus John Mayer and Jeff Chimenti and Oteil Burbridge. And their tour launches here in Raleigh down the road on the 16th of August. So I'm going to that. And then I was kindly invited by a friend to see him in Chicago at Wrigley Field a month after that. And then I'm going to go see him in Denver with my daughter. Gertie and I are in October. So I'm sort of living the post hippie, follow the Grateful Dead lifestyle. Although in this case, it involves plane rides and stuff. It's not, not in a bus that's hotboxing all the way to the concert.
So I'd be remiss if we didn't at this very end, and I know from the stats about there's only about 20% of the audience left here. So this is just kind of you and me and the hardcores on the podcast. You introduced me to a really great man named Tom Corey, who recently passed away, I think it would be we'd be remiss to not record a quick memory of him. Can you give just a quick bio of Tom Corey and who he was to you?
Yeah, so Tom was my father-in-law, passed away about 7 weeks ago now, I guess. Pretty interesting dude on multiple levels. He was the sole child of Carl and Gertie Corey, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1947 for seminal work they did on human metabolism. And they were really the first hardcore in vitro biochemists, the first people that figured out how to purify an enzyme and work on it in a test tube. And they were at Washington University in St. Louis, which was the mecca to train in that discipline. And something like 3 more Nobel Prize winners came out of their lab. They moved to Stanford before they got them, but all those people were trained there. So Tom was their sole child. Tom grew up in St. Louis, married my deceased mother-in-law, Belle, had 2 daughters, one of whom is my wife, Gertie. They moved out to California for a bit, came back, and then Tom spent his whole career at a company called Sigma Aldrich, which subsequently got purchased by Merck KGaA, the German Merck, back several years ago. But he grew that into a powerhouse specialty chemical company. And the biggest impact he had on me was getting me really interested in more general business aspects. I met him when I was a graduate student. I was training hard to get my PhD. I thought I was going to be a scientist. And I always had predilections toward other topics. I wasn't like a super narrow focused, go a mile deep on one thing kind of person, the way you have to be a successful academic. And so just interacting with him was a really important part of my development. And it's tough to have him gone, but he lived a big, happy, full life and had a huge impact on people. Probably the best example of that was the little impromptu non-memorial reception that was put together at his house, and by word of mouth, like 200 people ended up at this thing. It was like massive traffic jam on the street, and it was a bunch of former colleagues of his and people that just knew him from around town. So that was pretty neat. And but
yeah, you introduced me to him, and I had several really great experiences. It was like somebody that just was willing to tell you exactly what he thought, had a level of foresight and precision that was really amazing. And I had a chance to go to the memorial service for him, and the house was opened up, and you noticed that he had all of these interests. He had maps around his house. He had books of chemistry sitting out and photographs of him and his family. And I just thought it would probably be very worthwhile to mention him. He was the CEO of Sigma Aldrich and really grew that into a national treasure. And just like when Monsanto was sold to the Germans, I sat down with Tom Corey, and he told me exactly what was going to happen, how the Germans would take over, what their strategy would be, how the company would change. And I remember the things he was telling me at the time. I was like, that's preposterous, Tom. This is not, there's no way. And I wouldn't say we got to an argument, but we were definitely like, no, you're wrong, and him being quite confident and quite happy that he was going to be right. And what do you know, a year later he was exactly right on literally everything he said. So he was a fantastic man, and I'm really deeply grateful to you for having introduced him, and I thought it'd be worthwhile to memorialize him here.
No, thanks for that thought. Yeah, to be fair, he was the German acquirer more than once, but the American going and buying something else. So I think he knew the playbook pretty well.
Well, Eric Ward, I would have you on again anytime. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure, and thanks for leading the conversation in what I hope was productive and interesting directions for other people. I enjoyed it thoroughly, so I really appreciate the opportunity for the chat. Thank you.